Snow fell in slow, relentless sheets, soft enough to seem gentle, sharp enough to pierce. Brooklyn stood at the bus stop, shivering beneath a jacket far too thin for the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, her arms wrapped tightly around 2-month-old Maisie, whose tiny breath fogged against the curve of her neck. Her fingers were already numb, the sleeves of her coat stiff with frost, but she didn't dare loosen her grip, not just because of the weather, but because Maisie was the only warmth left in her life. Behind her, the front door had slammed minutes ago with a violence that echoed down the quiet suburban street, the sound still vibrating in her chest like an aftershock. Her father's voice had carried, not yelling this time, but low and venomous, each word another stone hurled at the ruins of what used to be their family. He had dragged her things to the curb without ceremony, tossed them into the snow like trash, bags unzipped, clothes spilling, baby bottles scattered among them like discarded plastic. He hadn't looked at her. That was the worst part. He hadn't even looked. Her mother had stood in the hallway, unmoving, eyes hollow, arms folded as if hugging her own shame. She hadn't spoken. Not when Brooklyn begged. Not when she cried. Not when she asked her to please say something. The silence had been the final blow, the confirmation that love could, in fact, have conditions. It was the pregnancy that had done it. The shame. The whispers. The disobedience. A child born outside the lines of purity the church demanded, a girl who had chosen her daughter over their reputation, over their rules, over the illusion of grace wrapped in fear. Brooklyn had chosen life, and they had chosen to erase her for it. Now she stood, teeth chattering, eyes burning from the wind, blinking rapidly as tears threatened to freeze on her lashes. Her body ached from the cold, from the weight of holding on, physically, emotionally, spiritually, but still, she stood. The streetlight above flickered, casting an indifferent yellow glow over the empty road, over the bus stop sign covered in frost, over her boots buried ankle-deep in snow. Each minute felt longer than the last. Each second dragged her lower into the chill. Maisie whimpered softly in her sleep, her cheeks flushed red against the white cotton of her hat, and Brooklyn adjusted the blanket with stiff fingers, whispering broken comfort she barely believed herself. Her temperature was falling. So was her strength. But she stayed upright, because collapse wasn't an option. Not with that little body pressed against hers. Not with those tiny fingers curling instinctively toward life. In the distance, headlights finally appeared, dim, then growing, 2 halos cutting through the snowfall like hope trying to reach her. The bus. Late, but coming. Her knees trembled. Her lips were blue. Her future uncertain. But for the first time in hours, something was moving toward her, not away. Brooklyn didn't believe in miracles anymore. But maybe this was something else. A last chance. Not offered with kindness, but born of necessity. The kind of chance you don't wait for, you survive for. And as the bus rumbled to a stop in front of her and the door creaked open, she stepped forward into the heat with her child in her arms, leaving behind the silence, the snow, and a house that would never be home again. The headlights sliced through the thick curtain of snow like twin blades, casting long, flickering shadows across the roadside and catching Brooklyn mid-step as she stood there, unsure whether to wait for another bus or simply keep walking into the storm. The old pickup truck came to a slow, creaking stop in front of her, engine coughing like an old smoker, tires crunching over ice that threatened to pull everything into stillness. The driver's side window rolled down with a mechanical groan, and out of the darkness leaned a woman whose appearance belonged more to a dream, or maybe a fevered tale told over tea, than to any real corner of the world. She had wild, unruly gray hair tucked under a lopsided knitted hat with a pom-pom on top that bobbed slightly as she tilted her head. Her eyes were bright, too bright, like they'd seen far too much to ever rest again, and they flicked quickly between Brooklyn and the baby in her arms. Her voice was raw but not unkind, tinged with urgency and something deeper that didn't leave room for argument. "Get in," the woman said without preamble, as if this meeting had been scheduled long ago. "The snow's faster than death tonight." Brooklyn hesitated. Her mind screamed caution, survival, 1,000 horror story headlines flashing in her head. But Maisie whimpered softly against her chest, her tiny body curled tightly in the crook of her arm, and the warmth from the bus earlier had already left them both like a memory. The wind tore at her, slicing through every layer of fabric, and her legs felt like they were made of wood. She looked into the woman's face, into those wild eyes, and saw something there that surprised her, clarity, not madness. Or maybe both. But behind it was instinct, conviction, and just the faintest glimmer of strange, stubborn kindness. "My name's Evelyn Hart," the woman added, softer now, like she understood the war playing out in Brooklyn's mind. "I've got soup and firewood and not enough sense to let a girl and her baby freeze to death." Brooklyn took one final look at the road behind her, dark, silent, lifeless, and then opened the passenger door. The smell of pine sap and old flannel rushed to meet her. She climbed in without a word. Maisie tucked close to her heart like a secret and pulled the door shut against the cold. Evelyn nodded once and pulled the truck back onto the road, her hands steady on the cracked steering wheel, the snow falling heavier now, erasing the path behind them. Brooklyn didn't speak. She didn't ask where they were going. She only held Maisie tighter and let herself exhale for the first time that night. Whatever came next, it would be warm. And for now, that was enough. They drove in silence. The kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. The kind that felt more like a pause in a long story rather than the end of a sentence. Snow pressed in from all sides, muting the world into a blur of white and shadow, while the forest around them thickened with each mile, the trees growing taller and closer, their dark limbs folding over the narrow road like arms drawing them into something ancient and forgotten. The old pickup rattled and groaned, headlights brushing over gnarled trunks and branches heavy with snow, but Evelyn drove like she knew the way by heart, as if the woods were simply part of her skin. The cabin appeared not at the end of the road, but almost as if the trees themselves had parted to reveal it, a small structure tucked into a hollow of pine and stone, the windows glowing gold against the gray of the storm. It wasn't large, wasn't impressive, but it pulsed with a strange sense of presence, like it had waited a long time to be seen again. Brooklyn stepped out slowly, Maisie still curled tight against her, and stared at the little house with its slanted roof and crooked chimney puffing smoke like a lazy exhale. Inside, the air was immediately thick with warmth and scent, cedar, clove, and something faintly herbal that lingered on the tongue like memory. The room was cluttered but intentional, every corner filled with curious life, shelves stacked with worn books and cloudy jars, stones arranged in spirals on the windowsill, strings of dried plants hanging from wooden beams like wind chimes that didn't need wind to hum. A pair of reading glasses rested atop an open volume on a side table, and on the mantel above the stone fireplace sat a large, dignified stuffed owl, its glass eyes gleaming with unsettling intelligence. The fire crackled without apology, flames licking at the logs as if feeding on something more than just wood. Brooklyn didn't speak. She took in the mismatched mugs, the layers of knitted blankets, the dried orange slices strung above the sink, and she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not comfort, not safety, not quite yet, but maybe the outline of a chance. It was strange and wild and entirely unlike anything she had ever known. But it was warm. And for the first time since her father threw her into the snow and her mother looked through her like glass, Brooklyn felt the faintest spark of something she had nearly buried beneath the cold. Hope. The days at the cabin passed without clocks, marked not by hours but by light through the trees and the creak of the old stove warming back to life each morning. Evelyn didn't believe in calendars or countdowns, only in the rhythm of doing. Work keeps the mind clean, she said once, handing Brooklyn a woven basket for kindling and pointing to the woodshed with her chin. And a clean mind doesn't collapse when the dark comes. There were no indulgent words, no gentle reassurances, but there was something deeper in Evelyn's presence, a steadiness, a clarity, a relentless sense of purpose that made the air in the cabin feel heavier, but also more meaningful. She didn't ask Brooklyn what had happened. She didn't press for stories. But each task she gave was a form of conversation, a way of saying, "You are capable, even if you don't believe it yet." Brooklyn was learning things her old world never allowed her to touch. She split wood, slowly at first, awkwardly, with trembling hands and a racing heart, until the rhythm of the axe began to sink into her bones like muscle memory she'd never earned but desperately needed. She learned how to mend a cracked kettle with resin and salt, how to hang herbs upside down from the beams for drying, how to listen for the sound of water beneath ice. Nothing was done for her, but nothing was denied either. And as her body grew stronger, so did something inside her, something long buried beneath shame and silence. Maisie thrived in the odd quiet of it all. The baby who had spent her earliest days surrounded by tension and raised voices was now cradled in soft wool blankets beside the fire, her cheeks flushed pink with warmth, her eyes growing brighter each day. Evelyn had a way with her, not doting, but attuned. She would hum under her breath while preparing tinctures, and Maisie would settle instantly, as if soothed by a language older than lullabies. "Babies know who's real," Evelyn once said, watching Brooklyn from across the room, "and who's just pretending to be." That truth stung more than Brooklyn expected. But it also lit something inside her, a hunger to be more than what she had been forced to become. She had lived her whole life performing a version of obedience, of femininity, of goodness tailored to the church, to her father, to expectations that left no room for mistakes. But here, mistakes were not punished. They were simply lessons. Wood stacked wrong fell, water left uncovered froze, and bread left too close to the fire burned. Evelyn didn't yell. She handed her the tools to fix it and walked away. At night, Brooklyn would sit near the fire after Maisie had fallen asleep, her arms sore from labor, her back aching, but her heart strangely quiet. She would watch the flames dance in the reflection of Evelyn's reading glasses as the older woman pored over a weathered book, and sometimes, just sometimes, Evelyn would look up and nod, not with approval, but with recognition. "This place doesn't give you what you want," she said one evening, eyes never leaving the page. "It gives you what you need, if you're strong enough to take it." Brooklyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. She pulled her sweater tighter, reached down to tuck the blanket more securely around Maisie, and listened to the wind outside rattle against the cabin's bones. In the past, that sound had meant danger, exile, judgment. But now it simply meant winter. And inside, in the heat of a fire she had kept burning with her own hands, Brooklyn began to feel something she hadn't dared name in months. Stability. Purpose. A future made with splinters and salt and effort. She was building it one day at a time. One log, one breath, one choice at a time. The cabin, for all its quiet chaos and organized clutter, held one space that remained untouched, undisturbed, and curiously sacred. It was a small door tucked between the hallway and the back wall of the pantry, painted the same warm wood color as the rest of the house but marked by a single detail that set it apart. A blue sign nailed at eye level, hand-painted in careful looping script, Eleanor's room. Do not enter. It was the only rule Evelyn had ever stated more than once, the only command she gave with no explanation and no exceptions. Brooklyn had passed it 100 times, carrying firewood or folded blankets or tea-stained mugs to the sink, but her eyes always caught on that sign, even when she tried not to look. The paint had faded in places, chipped at the edges, but the lettering was still legible, still steady, as if the name had been written with hands that hadn't shaken yet. There were no locks on any of the other doors in the cabin, but no one ever opened that one. Not Brooklyn, not Maisie, not even Evelyn. It was where silence lived, thick and still like the dust motes that floated through its narrow crack when the sunlight hit just right. Evelyn never walked past it without a pause, sometimes just a glance, sometimes a breath caught too short, as if something inside was pulling on her even after all these years. Brooklyn had learned quickly not to ask. The first time she mentioned it, Evelyn had simply said, "Some things don't need reopening," and the finality in her voice had been sharp enough to make the air go cold. Maisie, curious in the way only babies could be, would sometimes crawl toward it, her little hands patting the wood, her face pressed to the cool surface as if trying to listen to what lay on the other side. Brooklyn always pulled her gently away, whispering without knowing why, "Not there, love. That's not for us." And somehow, Maisie never cried when she was redirected, as if even she understood that the door was not just closed, it was sealed by something deeper than wood or hinges. It was sealed by grief. Brooklyn often wondered who Eleanor was, why her name still clung to that door like a breath never exhaled. The rest of the cabin was filled with memory, yes, but it was living memory. Worn books still read, stones still turned in hand, mugs still used. But that room was not alive. That room belonged to the past. Not like a story shared around the fire, but like a wow no one dared to clean. In a place where every corner had become part of Brooklyn's healing, every chair and quilt and broom and kettle now somehow woven into the new version of her life, that door remained a boundary. It reminded her that even the strongest people carried things they could not name aloud. It reminded her that survival wasn't always about letting go. Sometimes, it was about carrying something heavy in silence because there was no other way to honor what had been lost. Eleanor's room was more than a door. It was a memory with its hand pressed firmly against the glass, watching, waiting, and still too sharp to touch. It happened during the fourth storm of the season, a brutal, bone-deep kind of cold that turned the world outside into a white silence broken only by the sound of wind scraping against the windows. The generator sputtered once, twice, and then died with a final mechanical groan, plunging the cabin into sudden, biting stillness. The fire was already low, and Evelyn was gone. She had taken the sled to the edge of the forest earlier that morning, muttering about checking the lines, about things that couldn't wait, wrapped in her thickest coat and her resolve. Brooklyn tried everything she knew, checking wires, tapping gauges, even whispering useless encouragement to a machine that didn't care. The lights stayed out. The temperature dropped. And Maisie, bundled near the fireplace, whimpered in her sleep, her breath shallow, her skin already cooler than it should have been. That was when Brooklyn knew she couldn't wait. She needed more warmth, more blankets, anything that could trap heat until Evelyn returned. She remembered the blue sign. Eleanor's room. Do not enter. The words flickered in her mind like a warning and an invitation at once. She found the key tucked in the back of Evelyn's spice cabinet, behind an empty jar labeled sage that had long since lost its scent. It was old and cold in her palm, the kind of key that felt too heavy for something so small. Her heart beat hard as she approached the door, Maisie's faint cries pressing urgency into every step. She turned the lock, half expecting the earth to shake or some unspoken curse to fall around her shoulders. The door opened with a soft creak. Inside, time had stopped. The room was small, lit only by the faint gray light bleeding through the single frosted window, and yet every detail stood out with impossible clarity. A tiny bed with a quilt too bright for the gloom, a faded stuffed rabbit tucked against the pillow, shelves of picture books with worn spines, a rocking chair beside a child-sized dresser, painted a pale shade of blue. Photographs were pinned to a corkboard, blurry, joyful snapshots of a child with light in her eyes and curls spilling over her forehead, a little girl caught mid-laugh, held close to a younger version of Evelyn whose face still knew how to smile without sorrow. There were drawings, clumsy and full of heart, stuck to the walls with brittle tape. A child's coat hung on the back of the door. A pair of tiny boots sat beneath the window, still dusted with dried mud from a last forgotten walk. On the nightstand sat a cracked ceramic mug with a painted sun, and inside it a single button. Brooklyn stepped into the room, unable to breathe, the air thick with something sacred and broken. She didn't touch anything. She only looked. And then her eyes fell on the photo by the bed, Evelyn, holding a little girl wrapped in a heavy blanket, both of them soaked with snow, the child's face pale, her mouth open as if calling for something she never received. The photo was water-damaged, blurred at the edges, but the heartbreak was unmistakable. The edges of the room seemed to close in as Brooklyn realized what she had stepped into, what story this space had been keeping locked away. Eleanor, 3 years old, dead from pneumonia, in a storm, in her mother's arms. The details clicked together with brutal clarity. Why Evelyn boiled herbs 3 times before using them, Why she hovered over Maisie's breathing at night, why she had never left the fire untended for more than a few minutes, why the name on the door had been preserved like a monument. This was not just memory. This was guilt, still pulsing, still raw beneath every quiet act of care Evelyn had given without ever calling it love. Brooklyn stepped back, hands trembling, heart aching not from fear or regret, but from the weight of understanding. She closed the door slowly, gently, relocked it, and returned the key. When Evelyn came back, soaked with snow, her face lined deeper than before, Brooklyn didn't mention the room. She only handed her a towel and whispered, "The fire needs you." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment, something flickering in her eyes, knowing maybe or forgiveness, but she said nothing. She walked to the hearth, dropped to her knees, and began to stack kindling with hands that had once held a dying child. The silence that followed wasn't the old silence of pain. It was the quiet of two people who now carried something between them too fragile to name. The past had opened. And though it hurt, it had finally been seen, after the unspoken confession. The delicate moment that passed between them like a secret exchanged in silence. Everything shifted, not with drama, not with declarations, but with the quiet, steady gravity of something being rebuilt from the inside out. They didn't speak about Eleanor, not directly, but the weight of the memory no longer pressed so heavily in the air. It became something else, shared, acknowledged, and gently folded into the rhythm of the cabin's life. Work became communion. Each task was no longer a transaction of survival, but a conversation in action. Brooklyn and Evelyn moved around each other with a new awareness, handing off tools and tasks with the ease of people who no longer felt the need to fill space with noise. Evelyn taught Brooklyn how to patch a window with resin and cloth, how to snare rabbits without cruelty, how to tell the weather by the way the wind touched the tips of the trees. Brooklyn, in turn, showed Evelyn the little routines she was learning as a mother. How to calm Maisie when her gums ached, how to rock her without breaking rhythm, how to fold a cloth diaper tighter for warmth. In the middle of it all, Maisie blossomed. She rolled onto her belly with determination, reached for the bright threads of Evelyn's old shawl, babbled at the firelight like it was telling her stories. She laughed easily now, laughed with her whole body, the sound bright and boundless, echoing through the wooden walls like sunlight through frost. She reached for Evelyn often, not with fear or hesitation, but with trust, complete, wordless trust. And Evelyn, who once touched the child with reverence and restraint, now lifted her boldly, confidently, letting her fingers trail across Maisie's cheeks with something that looked like joy. Meals were made slowly, with both women standing side by side at the small wooden counter, passing herbs, crushing spices, boiling roots for tea, and learning how to flavor the simplest soup into something healing. They told stories in fragments, in backwards glances, in details that slipped out while peeling potatoes or mending socks. Brooklyn spoke of church halls and small-town judgment, of the way her mother's silence had hurt more than her father's rage. Evelyn spoke, eventually, of the blizzard, of the fever that came too fast, of the sound of Eleanor's breath turning shallow, and the miles of snow between them and help. But those stories no longer bled. They breathed. They found peace not in stillness, but in motion, in the turn of the seasons, in the sweeping of the floor, in the smell of wood smoke on hair and clothes. Brooklyn no longer counted days by what she lacked but by what she'd done. Wood stacked, soup made, a baby soothed, a woman met halfway in the middle of an old wound. Evelyn, who had once moved through the world like a ghost clutching grief too tightly to speak of, now laughed sometimes, especially when Maisie tried to gnaw on her buttons, or when Brooklyn burned the bread just slightly and blamed the stove for being emotionally unstable. The cabin no longer felt like a place between things. It had become the thing itself, the life, the world, the center. Brooklyn no longer dreamed of escape. She dreamed of tomorrow. And Evelyn, without ever admitting it, began to believe again that not all stories ended in storms. Together they worked. And through that work, they healed. They arrived without warning, just as the snow began to thin and the earth softened beneath the first promise of spring. The sky was pale and clear, and the sound of meltwater trickled down from the mountains, filling the forest with the hush of new beginnings. But that peace shattered the moment the old pickup truck appeared at the edge of the clearing, too clean, too unfamiliar, its tires chewing up the thawing earth as it pulled beside the cabin like it belonged. Connor stepped out first, looking older but no wiser, dressed like someone who had practiced what he thought contrition should look like. Behind him came Brooklyn's parents, wrapped in coats too expensive for the woods, their faces stiff with discomfort hidden beneath smiles stretched too tight. They carried bags, gifts wrapped in gold ribbon, a stuffed bear for Maisie, boxes of formula, things they assumed would be enough to erase months of silence. Apologies followed, almost immediately, pouring from mouths that hadn't spoken her name without bitterness since the day she left. But there was something beneath the softness, attention curled into every word. They were sorry, yes, but only on their terms. Connor spoke first, his voice low, rehearsed, and too casual for the weight of the moment. He said he had been lost, that he hadn't known what to do, that he missed Brooklyn, that he wanted to know his daughter. He looked at Maisie like she was a question he hadn't studied for, standing too far back, hands in his pockets, unsure of how to be needed. Then came the words Brooklyn had expected but still dreaded. "We could do this right," he said, eyes flicking between her and the cabin, like the trees themselves were watching. "Get married. Make it official. Bring Maisie back to town where she belongs." Her mother nodded, too quickly. "The church has forgiven you, Brooklyn." There's room again if you come back now with Connor. People want to help. They just want to see a family again. But Brooklyn was already different. She stood at the edge of the porch, Maisie balanced on her hip, her spine straight, her eyes steady. The woman who had once begged for acceptance, who had once cried in the snow with nowhere to go, no longer lived in that skin. She had chopped wood with trembling arms, learned to start fires in the dark, soothed a child through teething and fever and cold nights when there was no one to lean on but herself. She had held Evelyn's grief without flinching, and in return, learned how to carry her own. She looked at Connor, at the man who had disappeared when she needed him most, who now offered stability dressed in shame and structure. Then she looked at her parents, who still couldn't meet her eyes for more than a moment without looking away, as though the weight of what they'd done might crack the floor beneath them. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice calm, not cruel. "I found something here that none of you could offer me back there. I found honesty. I found strength. And I found out who I am when no one's trying to fix me." Her father's mouth opened, but she raised a hand, silencing him with more grace than he deserved. "You can see Maisie," she continued, "but not with conditions. Not if you're still trying to package us into something that looks good from the outside. She'll grow up knowing who she is, not just what you expect her to be." Evelyn stood behind her, arms folded, quiet, unshakable. She didn't speak, didn't interfere. But she was there, like a tree that had stood through every season. Connor looked at the ground. Brooklyn's mother clutched the stuffed bear like it was a peace offering and a shield. No one argued. Not because they agreed, but because they knew she wasn't theirs to shape anymore. Brooklyn turned and carried her daughter back into the cabin, past the warmth of the fire, past the shelves lined with dried herbs and mismatched books, past the door that said Eleanor's room and into the heart of the life she had built with her own hands. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth instead of ice. Old faces had come. But she no longer needed them to feel whole. The announcement came not with ceremony but with quiet certainty, spoken over the dinner table as steam curled from the pot of lentil stew and the fire crackled low in the hearth. Brooklyn's voice didn't waver, didn't rise for impact or fall for approval. She simply looked up from her bowl, brushed a lock of hair from Maisie's forehead, and said, "I'm going to Fairbanks University. To study ecology." The words settled into the room like stones dropped into still water. Evelyn didn't speak right away, but her eyes lifted slowly, meeting Brooklyn's with a quiet depth that said everything approval never could. She didn't smile, but she nodded once, slow and solid, as if she had known it all along. "Good," she said simply, reaching for another piece of bread. "The land needs people who listen." Brooklyn's parents froze in place, forks hovering midair, their faces stretched into the polite expressions of people who had come expecting control and found something stronger instead. Her mother blinked rapidly, and her father cleared his throat, but neither said a word. They had come hoping to pull her back, to rewrite the story, to reshape her life into something that could fit inside their version of redemption. But the girl they once cast out had become someone they didn't recognize, someone they couldn't command. Connor looked as if he had misheard, leaning back slightly, eyes flicking toward Maisie and then to Brooklyn, as though the two could not exist alongside ambition. "Wait," he said, slow, cautious. "Like, to study? Full-time?" "Yes," Brooklyn answered without hesitation. "It's what I want. I've already applied. There's a program that starts in the fall. I'll work until then." Evelyn said, "I can stay as long as I need." Maisie gurgled from the basket beside the stove, kicking her feet against the woven blanket Evelyn had made from scraps of old wool sweaters. The little girl was growing stronger every day, curious and steady and filled with a light that had nothing to do with the past she'd been born into. Brooklyn glanced at her daughter and felt no fear about the future, only fire. There had been too many years where her choices weren't hers. Too many days where she moved like a shadow behind her parents' pride. Too many nights where dreams had to be silent because they didn't fit the image expected of her. But the forest had given her back her voice, and the work had given her back her body, and Evelyn, without softness, without preaching, had given her back her sense of possibility. "I want to study systems," she continued, her voice gaining warmth now, "to understand how things connect, how things fall apart, and how they can be repaired. Not just land. People too." No one argued. They didn't need to. Because the decision had already been made, not in that moment, but in every step that brought her here, in every log she'd carried, in every fever Maisie had survived, in every silence Evelyn had allowed to bloom into truth. The path ahead would not be easy. It would be long, filled with classes and work shifts and nights of exhaustion. But it would be hers. Brooklyn looked out the window, where the sky had turned to soft lavender, and the snow was finally melting into earth. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't hoping for rescue. She was choosing. And her future would belong only to her. The move to Fairbanks came quietly, without fanfare or final goodbyes, only the sound of boxes being closed, windows latched, and snow falling gently on the roof of the cabin one last time as the forest watched them go. Evelyn had never spoken much about her house in the city, only mentioned it in passing as something she'd held onto, a place from another version of herself, long before grief rooted her in solitude. But it was there, waiting for them, a modest two-story home on a quiet street lined with bare birches and faded porch lights, surrounded by neighbors who didn't ask questions, only nodded politely and kept shoveling snow. They moved in together, not as a family defined by blood or law, but by something stronger, choice, resilience, the bond forged in silence and survival. The house smelled different from the cabin, less of pine and smoke, more of warm floors and old paper, but there was comfort in the creak of the stairs and the way Evelyn kept her herbs hanging from the kitchen window, as if no place was truly livable without wild mint and lavender close at hand. Maisie adjusted first, as children often do. Her laughter filled the corners of the house before the furniture was fully unpacked. She went to kindergarten in a little red jacket, holding Brooklyn's hand with wide eyes and fearless curiosity, waving goodbye each morning as if leaving her mother for the day was no longer the end of the world, just the beginning of another adventure. She came home with crayon drawings, stickers on her sleeves, and stories told in breathless excitement. And every afternoon, she ran into Evelyn's arms with the same confidence she once showed the fire in the cabin, sure it would always be there to warm her. Brooklyn walked across campus every morning with a satchel full of books and notes, her name now on class rosters and essays, no longer erased, no longer hidden behind expectations. She studied systems ecology, her hands just as comfortable turning pages as they once were splitting logs. She asked questions, challenged ideas, stayed late in the lab, and came home to warm dinners and new chapters of a life that once seemed impossible. The girl who had stood at a bus stop with nothing but her child in a thin coat had now become a woman who walked with purpose, carrying knowledge, hope, and the quiet strength of someone who had rebuilt herself by hand. And Evelyn changed too. She became something she had once sworn she could never be again. She registered for seminars, joined a local ecology group, dusted off notebooks, and began recording plant life patterns in the city's green spaces. But more than that, she became a grandmother in the truest sense, not by title, but by action. She packed lunches, wiped runny noses, waited at bus stops with a thermos of tea and a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She read bedtime stories without looking at the pages and made Maisie giggle by pretending not to know how buttons worked. There were moments, quiet and sharp, when she would pause with a far-off look in her eyes, and Brooklyn knew where her thoughts had gone. To Eleanor. To the girl who never got to grow into the world. But Evelyn no longer flinched from the memory. She carried it openly now, like a photo worn soft at the corners, something folded into the pocket of her life with reverence, not regret. The three of them made a life that didn't need explaining, a mosaic of past and present, pain and healing, held together not by perfection, but by truth. They grew things in the window boxes. They argued about groceries. They fixed things that broke. They stayed. In a city that once felt too big, too loud, too far away from anything safe, they had made something simple and extraordinary. A home. IT started with a letter, folded neatly and slipped into the mailbox with no return address, only a university crest and a name Brooklyn recognized from one of her textbooks. The language was polite, professional, but beneath the academic formalities was a current of genuine curiosity, even admiration. Someone had come across Evelyn's old records, her hand-drawn maps of migratory patterns, her field notes on seasonal plant behaviors, her meticulous documentation of climate shifts in the forest she had once vanished into. Notes that had lived for decades in battered notebooks stacked beneath her bed, thought lost to time, had somehow found their way into the hands of the scientific community. Evelyn read the letter 3 times, her expression unreadable, the edges of the page trembling slightly in her hands. She said nothing at first, only set it down beside her tea and stared at the steam rising from her mug. Brooklyn waited, knowing better now than to rush her, until Evelyn finally spoke, her voice low and careful, like stepping into a room long sealed shut. I didn't think any of it would matter anymore. But it did. The data, the decades of silent observation, the slow accumulation of truths gathered not in a lab, but in the stillness of the woods, they mattered more than either of them had realized. A research group invited Evelyn to speak. At first, she declined. Then she accepted, with Brooklyn by her side. Together, they began to sort through the notebooks, some written in near code, others with sketches in the margins, all of them marked with a quiet, relentless dedication. Brooklyn helped digitize them, entering decades of field data into spreadsheets, scanning fragile pages and cross-referencing them with her own university studies. What began as a task became a partnership, then a passion. They weren't just archiving Evelyn's past, they were building something new from it. Lectures followed. Small at first, then larger. Evelyn, who once hid behind silence and loss, now stood in front of classrooms filled with eager students and curious researchers, her voice measured, unwavering, full of knowledge drawn from years of living with the land instead of merely studying it. She didn't teach like a professor. She taught like a witness, and people listened. Brooklyn watched her mother figure transform from caretaker to mentor to scientist once more, and in doing so, she too found a new dimension to her path. They spoke at conferences together, Evelyn with her journals, Brooklyn with her graphs, side by side at long wooden tables, presenting not just data, but lived knowledge passed between generations. Their research became a project, then a paper, then a grant. What had once been hidden in a cabin was now being shared in laboratories, in publications, in rooms where voices like Evelyn's had once been ignored. And always at the center of it was the kitchen table, scattered with maps and teacups, crayon drawings from Maisie overlapping notes on soil temperatures. Their home was no longer just a shelter. It was a lab, a classroom, a place where the past and future met in real time. Maisie watched it all, growing up surrounded by questions and answers, by mistakes that turned into discoveries, by two women who proved that knowledge didn't come from titles or institutions, but from paying attention and refusing to give up. The return of science wasn't about recognition or status. It was about reclaiming a voice long silenced by grief, about turning personal survival into public knowledge, and about building a legacy that mattered, not just for them, but for the world they were helping to understand, one observation at a time. Maisie grew up not in the shadow of her mother's struggle or Evelyn's grief, but in the light that came after, the warmth of healing, of purpose, of lives rewritten by choice rather than fear. From the time she could walk, she was drawn to the edges of things. The soft curve where moss met stone, the quiet places beneath trees where light flickered like secrets, the forgotten corners of the garden where pine cones fell and insects burrowed unseen. Her pockets were always full, tiny treasures, smooth stones, curled leaves, feathers, and seeds she insisted on planting in every bit of soil she could reach. She moved through the world with a quiet confidence that came from being surrounded not by rules but by rhythm. She knew the names of plants before she could spell her own. She could identify lichen by texture, moss by shade. She asked questions that stretched across sky and soil. Why do clouds hold rain? Where do roots go when the ground freezes? What happens to the bees when the snow doesn't come? And every question was met not with a dismissal, but with a journey toward the answer. Sometimes Brooklyn would kneel beside her with a book, tracing diagrams with their fingertips. Sometimes Evelyn would fold her into the curve of her arm and read aloud from scientific journals, pausing to explain new words with a patience that never wore thin. Maisie listened, absorbed, questioned again, and in doing so became not just a student, but a seed of everything they had worked to rebuild. She understood that the world was fragile and vast, that science wasn't just something you studied. It was something you lived, something you touched with your hands and protected with your voice. Her drawings lined the refrigerator next to Evelyn's climate models and Brooklyn's grant charts, bright scribbles of trees and birds and water cycles, filled with arrows and hearts, like diagrams written in love as much as logic. The home, no matter how busy it became with deadlines and discoveries, always centered around her. Maisie was the heartbeat, the spark that brought motion to meaning. She didn't just represent the future. She shaped it with every question she asked, every stone she lifted to look beneath, every time she said, "Let's try," instead of "That's too hard." She was not just a child born of hardship. She was an heiress, not to wealth, but to wisdom, to resilience, to curiosity passed down through hands that had once trembled but now built futures. She carried in her the echo of a storm survived, the quiet of forests that remember, the voices of two women who chose truth over silence. Maisie was the center of the home not because she demanded it, but because she embodied everything they had fought for: growth, wonder, and the promise that the next chapter would begin not in fear, but in hope. They came back like ghosts knocking on the door of a house that no longer remembered their names, Connor and Brooklyn's parents, arriving without warning once more, dressed in forced smiles and holding gifts they had not chosen. Words they had practiced in the car but hadn't truly earned. Their eyes scanned the front yard, freshly raked, with Maisie's toy shovel still stuck in a flower bed, and lingered on the window where steam curled behind curtains, where laughter echoed from a life that had moved on without them. Brooklyn met them at the door, not surprised, not angry, only steady. Her hands were dusted with flour from baking bread, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable but not closed. Maisie was in the living room, humming to herself as she flipped through a picture book about trees, her socks mismatched, her fingers tracing roots drawn in green crayon. Connor stepped forward first, eyes softer than before, but still uncertain, still carrying the weight of a man who had let too much slip through his hands. "We were in town," he said, "and we thought maybe it's time to try again." For Maisie. For all of us. Her mother stepped beside him, adjusting her coat, offering a familiar smile that no longer held power. "You don't have to do it alone, sweetheart. You can come home." Brooklyn didn't flinch. She didn't fold into herself the way she used to when those voices filled her head with doubt. Instead, she stood taller, hands still dusted with flour, the smell of rosemary rising behind her from the oven, the quiet confidence of someone who had long since learned how to breathe without permission. "I am home," she said, and her voice didn't rise, but it settled deep, like roots claiming the soil beneath them. "I'm a mom. I'm a student. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Connor looked down and her parents blinked, confused, as if they had expected something else. A plea, a crack, a door open just wide enough for guilt to crawl through. But Brooklyn wasn't the same girl they had turned their backs on. She wasn't waiting for them to grant her a second chance. She had already given that to herself. She didn't explain her choices. She didn't offer them comfort. She didn't ask for understanding. Because she no longer needed to. Behind her, Maisie called out, her voice bright with curiosity, asking what kind of seeds they would plant next. Brooklyn turned back toward the warmth of the house, toward the life she had built with her own hands, toward the child who never had to earn her love, and left the door open just enough for the cold to remind them. She had made it without them. And that was enough. The invitation came on university letterhead, crisp and official, but the words carried something more than formality. They carried recognition, long overdue, wrapped in the warmth of admiration and academic respect. Evelyn Hart, once forgotten by the world she had quietly observed from the forest's edge, was now asked to return not as a footnote, but as a visiting researcher, a lecturer, a voice worth listening to. Fairbanks University wanted her fieldwork, her stories, her vision shaped by years of solitude and science, and Evelyn, without blinking, accepted. She stepped into lecture halls with her sleeves rolled up and a scarf always draped loosely around her shoulders, speaking not like a professor, but like someone who had lived everything she taught. Students leaned in, notebooks forgotten, as she spoke about ecosystems like they were living bodies and weather patterns like moods that could be trusted if you knew how to read them. She spoke on podcasts in a voice that never rose above a calm, deliberate cadence, sharing stories of data collected on frost lines and wild herbs, of learning to listen to land that had no voice but carried truth all the same. Around campus, they called her the mentor grandmother, not out of condescension but reverence. She became a fixture, a figure of wisdom who handed out knowledge the way others passed out coffee, in small, potent sips that warmed and stayed. Students came to her not only for guidance on their projects, but for questions about life, grief, purpose, and how to navigate the weight of uncertainty. And Evelyn, with her sharp eyes and soft silences, always answered honestly, sometimes with a story, sometimes with a question, and sometimes with nothing at all but a long look that said, "You already know." But it was in the evenings, when the lectures ended and the applause faded, that Evelyn returned to the role she had come to love more than any title. She came home, kicked off her boots, and settled into the old armchair beside the fireplace, where Maisie waited every night like clockwork, knees tucked under her chin, eyes wide with anticipation. Evelyn never read from books at bedtime. Instead, she told stories of stones. She spoke of quartz as if it had moods, of basalt with a stubborn streak, of river stones that remembered being mountains. She gave each one a name, a story, a secret history. To Maisie, the world became populated with quiet companions, smooth friends carried in pockets, treasures held under pillows, each one a character in an ever-growing constellation of natural wonder. Evelyn told her which rocks held heat the longest, which ones sang when struck just right, which ones could predict rain. And Maisie, open-hearted and endlessly curious, listened as if learning the language of magic. This was not the family Evelyn had once imagined. It was something far richer. It was chosen. It was earned. It was alive. Brooklyn, now deep in her studies, often sat nearby during these stories, notebook in hand, smiling to herself as Evelyn spun yet another tale about a stone with a sense of humor or a pebble that used to be part of a glacier. These moments, soft and ordinary, became the foundation of everything they had built. They were not bound by blood, but by time, truth, and love shaped in the crucible of hardship. A family of choice. A circle formed not by obligation, but by belief in each other, in second chances, in stories told beside a fire with a child who believed every stone had a heart. And perhaps in Evelyn's stories, they did. There was no perfection in their home, no scripted harmony or flawless days where everything unfolded as planned. The dishes sometimes sat in the sink longer than they should have. Brooklyn's textbooks were often sprawled across the kitchen table beneath Maisie's crayon drawings, and Evelyn occasionally forgot to label the herbs she left drying in every corner of the house. But what filled the space between those imperfections was something stronger, something far more enduring than neatness or order. There was truth. The kind of truth that didn't need to be spoken every day because it lived in the way they showed up for each other, in the way Evelyn would wordlessly place a cup of mint tea by Brooklyn's side when she studied too long into the night, or how Brooklyn would take over dinner when Evelyn had a long day of teaching, never asking, only knowing. It lived in how Maisie ran freely through the house, never told to be quieter, never told to be less, always welcome exactly as she was. There was warmth, not just from the fire that always burned in the hearth, but from the way laughter came easily, from the comfort of knowing that even when voices were raised or tensions surfaced, no one would walk away. Mistakes were made. Words sometimes came out wrong. But forgiveness was a constant presence, never asked for like a favor, never handed out like a prize, but given because love lived in that space between error and understanding. And above all, there was choice. Every day, they chose to be there, not because blood demanded it or tradition dictated it, but because love asked for nothing more than presence, honesty, and care. They were a family not made by inheritance or ceremony, but by moments. A mother who rebuilt herself, a child who reminded them all how to look forward, and a woman who once locked her heart behind a cabin door and now gave it away in stories, in lectures, in quiet acts of devotion. It wasn't love that fell from the sky. It was love that was built, stone by stone, task by task, mistake by mistake. It was not the kind of love that demanded grand declarations. It was the kind that made dinner after a long day, that held a child through a fever, that stayed awake until the other returned home. It was the kind that endures because it is real, because it is chosen again and again. And in that house, in the mismatched chairs, in the overlapping voices, in the scent of firewood and fresh tea, lived the kind of family many dream of, but few ever take the time to build. Not perfect, but true. And that, after all, is what real love looks like.